In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck.
Today, we're in part two of government subsidies. And I wanted to look in particular at government's attempt to, build up an industry out of, I don't want to say out of nothing, but when there's low interest, when there's not a lot there. And the two that are most commonly cited for this are solar and the electric car industry. But there's other examples of that as well. So I think that there's I'm sure there's multiple reasons, but the two primary reasons I think why the government want to do this is that there's an overall social benefit for a shift to these two particular technologies. And then other technologies as well. And so it's in society, our country, in society's interest that we start to adopt these. And the government has the ability to push the technology along a little bit as we get increased adoption of the technologies. The technology improves, it becomes more efficient. And as it reaches a certain critical mass, there'll come a point where the industry can often then or should become self-sustaining. And then, of course, at that point, the government would usually back out. You could also look at how the government investment has brought about things like the internet, some of the satellite technology like GPS, which started out as a military, both those started out as a military technology, but then of course we adopted it in the civilian world as well. So where do you want to take this?
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument to be made, I'll grant you that. And there is some benefit that is derived from it. I think the risk that I see is that the government, like anybody, would at times make poor choices. Like any business, at times they invest in the wrong thing. So some companies that have a lot of promise, they go out and even though they think they have a great product, they don't, or people aren't interested in it, or they can't provide a great service, and then that new company, that new product can fall on its face. A couple of bad examples that I would give. One is probably more pertinent. The other one, I'll make the argument for it, is one, government for years focused on ethanol. And you said the most commonly cited example, like I think ethanol is a pretty commonly cited example, and it resulted in all kinds of unintended consequences. Price of corn went up, and they had to find substitutes. So they had high fructose corn syrup became much more prevalent, which was really unhealthy for people. And many people see that as a result of their investment, I guess you could call it, in ethanol and other corn products. And then we can look at other industries where they have made poor choices, like nuclear. So nuclear energy, they've really restricted. They haven't provided the subsidies. They provided huge subsidies for the oil and gas industry, for coal, and they haven't done it. They've made it almost impossible. I mean, we haven't had a new nuclear power plant since the 1970s. And so for all these years, when we look back on it now, nuclear is one of the safest, it's like top 1 or 2 or 3 safest energy. I think only hydroelectric power is safer, and it's one of the.
What do you mean by safer?
Per kilowatt hour produced, fewer deaths.
Really?
Yep.
So, okay, the deaths of coming from nuclear are fairly obvious and clear. I can imagine the deaths coming from, say, coal would perhaps come, the miners in particular, poor working environment. I'm not sure about what would the deaths be from, say, electric. or hydroelectric?
Well, electric is, obviously electric is just electricity is produced by one of those other sources. So, we're talking these are all electric.
Okay.
But hydroelectric, there's very few. Yeah, it's just about if any one of them is safer as far as deaths than nuclear, it's hydroelectric power.
Okay.
The only problem anybody has with hydroelectric power is the environmental concerns that come from it. But after all these years, we find that, I mean, you can look this up. It's readily available that per kilowatt hour, nuclear is one of the safest. I mean, coal and even natural gas, the pollution that comes from it, they have, they attribute many deaths each year to the pollution that comes from coal and these other products. But yeah, just extracting them from the ground. And for years, everybody was talking about how, well, we have this nuclear waste. Where are we going to put it all? And I read a statistic recently. It's something like 6 football fields would contain all of the nuclear waste that has ever been produced. And we can reuse those spent nuclear fuel rods in the 3rd generation nuclear plants that they're producing now. So for all these years, they've been restricting the use of nuclear power, and it's killed more people. It's caused more carbon emissions. And it's caused us to use a ton more coal than we otherwise would have. So the government is picking and choosing these industries, and they don't do a good job of it. And there's plenty of examples of it. Now, I mean, I am a fan of electric cars. I like them. And I think it probably is a good place for us to go, is for the industry in general to head there. I just don't think that the government is fit to be able to make the decisions about where we should invest our money and which industries should win and which industries should lose. They should stay out of that completely. That's the whole point of a free market. The free market is much better at allocating resources. Now, they can step in very cautiously and very minimally and say, hey, if you're causing pollution, or, I mean, just as an example, electric cars, the data is still inconclusive that they're even more environmentally friendly than internal combustion engines, because of all of the energy that it takes to produce these batteries, and where we're going to put this waste when it's all said and done, and the fact that there's plenty of people out there that are charging their cars from coal-powered plants. So they have a home charger. They're getting their power from coal-powered plants, and then charging their cars with it. Now, that may still be more efficient than internal combustion, until you take into account that there is a tremendous amount of energy and carbon that goes into producing these massive batteries. So there's at least an argument to be had there that it's not as clean. Some people think, oh my gosh, electric cars are so much better. They're so much cleaner. And I've read articles that argue both directions, and I'm not quite sure which one is going to be better. Maybe over time it'll be better. But because we focused on this, because the government said to focus on this and didn't focus on other things like nuclear or hydrogen powered cars, that is not a good place for the government to be. They've proven time and again that they make poor investment decisions in these types of areas. So it's not a good idea that we let them make these decisions for us.
Well, I would agree with you on the nuclear situation, although I think that's probably more of an example of the government leading from the back. And what I mean is that there's a general popular opinion that nuclear is super dangerous. And I think this comes from the fact that when it fails catastrophically. It's not like a transformer explodes or we get some leaking coal into the air. We if you look at Chernobyl, that land is they're still very careful around that area, and that was 40 years ago. So it has a very dramatic failure when it does fail, and rightly or wrongly, and I do think that most people are wrong in this. It has made people reluctant, and the government, being a democracy, is saying, well, we would have a really hard time putting a plant, a nuclear power plant in anybody's neighborhood, wherever we put it, people are going to be freaking out, because even when we start talking about it, people freak out. And so there's always been a lot of pushback from the people. Now, when you look at their choice in supporting the car industry, I would, or actually, before we go there, you often will point out their failures, as example, nuclear, and another example, ethanol, or at least their poor choices, the bad decision making, and say, therefore, government always makes bad choices. And I could say, well, they've made some good choices as well. The internet is an example. Satellites and GPS would be other good examples of the internet, of the government making bets and supporting industry, and the world benefiting, at least our country benefiting by that investment. So yes, they do make bad bets, and they also do make good bets. And like any good investor, you want to make sure that your bets that may have a positive return outweigh your bets that have a negative return. And I would hope the government is also having some sort of checking their balance sheet from time to time, and simply not taking taxpayer money and throwing it out there and saying, let's see where all this lands, and hopefully some of it will make us some money. Sure, they've made some bad choices, but I think they've also made some good choices as well. You look like you wanted to respond to that, so I'll give you the space.
I definitely do. First off, to gloss over the fact that I think maybe we should even have a conversation about how poor the decision to restrict the spread of nuclear power was. Think of the carbon that has entered the atmosphere. Think of what could have been different all these years. Those coal-powered plants, sure, it's a democracy, and if they came out and said, "Hey, let's look at the data. It's not that different," and we're not even talking about investing in nuclear power, just allowing the plants to open. It's one of the most efficient and one of the cleanest and one of the safest ways to produce power. And we haven't opened up a new nuclear power plant in 70 years. The amount of carbon that has entered the atmosphere as a result of that is astronomical. Sure. And so if we just gloss over that and say, and then you act as if the government, I think it's crazy to think that the government is going to, from time to time, look at their balance sheet and decide, oh, we're doing well here, we're doing poorly there. First of all, they shouldn't have a balance sheet like that. They're not investors, and they never do that. If you have a bad government program, all they have to do is raise taxes, or there's no way to get rid of it. Government programs stay in place forever. They don't. Nobody calls them to account. There's not there's these. We can look at their balance sheet and say, how good was our investment in X or Y or Z, or how good was our investment in ethanol? People can call them out a little bit, but we don't really know, the effects that they've had on the nuclear power industry, on anything else. And to say that the internet wouldn't have happened on its own without them, there's a lot of individual investment, and maybe it would have gone a different direction. Maybe they would have done things that made more sense. There's all kinds of papers out there that talk about how the FCC restricted communications and picks winners and losers. And the other thing, that they have caused poor decisions to be made because there are so many restrictions from them. I find it really hard to believe that the government is going to sit back and take a look at. When you look at, you can tell exactly, when you have Home Depot or Walmart or McDonald's, you can see how well they're doing. To see how well a government program is doing is just impossible. There's plenty of failed industries out there. We don't know what decisions were made, to go in one direction and not another, like with nuclear power, because we don't even know what would have happened if they hadn't put their finger on the scale and decided to go with coal or oil or whatever else they decided to do. Am I making sense at all with that?
Yeah, you are. But remember that this whole conversation today is really about the government as an investor, because that's really what we're talking about with their subsidies of new industry, is that they believe that there's going to be some sort of return. And maybe the return is an industry that grows from the investment. Maybe the return is that we're going to start to make a transition from dirty energy to cleaner energy, like from coal power plants to solar and wind power. So that is really what we're talking about, is the government as an investor. What?
or from nuclear to coal power.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, I know you're going to keep on going back to the nuclear, and like I said, you're preaching to the choir here. I don't think it was a wise choice. At the same time, you had a lot of noise around the country saying they didn't want nuclear power, to use the old NIMBY acronym, the not in my backyard. And if everyone's saying not in my backyard, there's no place to put it. And so, and I'm not saying it's a good decision. I do agree with you that I think it's something that there should have been more investment and people should have done more for it. But here we are. And it's not that the government, well, I guess in a way they did choose coal over nuclear. But really what we're talking about here is the government saying, we want some of these other industries to start to develop. And yes, maybe there was some that they could have chosen other industries. But I also, if we focus on that premise right now, solar, electric vehicles, that these are good choices. And if you look at their investment in particular in Tesla, not only did they get their money back, they made a profit. And of course, when I say they, meaning the government, I mean we, as in the taxpayers, right? We made profit. Now, we didn't see any of that profit necessarily. If sure, it went to some other government program, but I think it'd be hard to argue that was a bad investment because money came back. The business was successful. We have an electric vehicle industry that is now starting to grow in this country. So in that particular instance, I'm not seeing a downside.
Well, because you're not looking at the opportunity cost of what we did, what else that could have been used for, what else that money could have been invested in. You're just saying, hey, this was good, but maybe we would have focused more on hydrogen electric cars, or we would have on some other industry that I don't even know about. When they start, like if we say, hey, the free market is better at making investment decisions than the government. That's why communism, or that's why the Soviet Union failed to compete with us, is because the free market is better at it. The only thing that the free market is bad at is, enforcing contracts, ensuring, avoiding negative externalities. The government can focus on those things, but we can look at plenty of examples where centrally planned economies are bad. But people say, well, they're mostly bad, but they can do a little bit. Like, as long as they're not doing too much of it, then the government's okay. As long as I agree with some of the decisions they're making, like I think electric cars are a great idea. So if the government does it, then I'm fine with that. But it just doesn't make sense to me, because if we're saying the government is not, that centrally planned economies are not ideal because they're not good at making these investment decisions that we're talking about. And like you said, you said, well, Colin, you're saying that the government never makes a good investment decision. No, I never said that. And I would agree that from time to time, they can make good investment decisions. And this may even be a good investment decision. I'll concede all of that. But I would say that because they're going to make mistakes, we shouldn't let them do it. And because the free market is better at making these decisions for us, of deciding where the resources should go, we should leave it to the free market. We should not let the government step in and try to figure out, like, I don't know why we think, it's easy just to point to like Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump, and say, oh my gosh, I want them to be making my investment decisions for me. Like, of course we don't. Now then we'd say, well, that there's a whole bureaucracy under them that are making these decisions. Well, I don't know, it's just not an ideal situation. The market is so broad and so complex, they can't be experts in everything. And even the people that are experts that are in the solar industry, many of them fail. But we think, oh, well, the government's going to make good choices. I can't say they never will, but there's going to be too many mistakes. And when I look at the most glaring of them, which the first one that comes to mind right now is that nuclear power, which for 70 years, they pointed us in the wrong direction. We had a solution. We had a source of energy that was going to be cheap, safe, and very effective. And we decided not to go forward with it. There are still plants from the 1960s that are running that we have never had problems with. And we have not improved the technology like we should have. That is ancient technology, and it's still working great. And still, even though those plants are 70, 80 years old, it's still one of the safest ways to produce electricity. I can't believe it. And so when you say, well, I mean, the government was just doing what the people wanted, like maybe they were, but the government should know better. If we're going to put if we're going to put the decision-making power in their hands, then they should know better about the fact that it was not like they had the data back then that it was not producing the nuclear waste that people were so worried about. I know about all the NIMBY and the not in my backyard or whatever. And I heard about it when they were coming to, where was it? It was like Utah somewhere, like Yucca Mountain. Mm-hmm. And nobody wanted them to come there. And if they had really talked about it and told us that, oh my gosh, it's very little waste, and they're developing technologies right now that will reuse that waste in the new generation power plants, maybe the decision would have been different. But the government didn't help us out with that because they make poor choices. But yeah, that's such a bad decision over 70 years that generated so many greenhouse gases. To just write that off and like, well, sometimes they make bad choices. That was such a disastrous choice.
All right. So if we consider the government planning the economy on one end of the spectrum, and the government staying entirely hands off and letting the market decide, make all the decisions. Between those two extremes, there is a huge range. So when the government is deciding that they want to go and loan some money to Tesla, I think that you're not on the precipice of communism. We're not right there. So to try and make that, try and say that we're right on the edge, that, pretty soon the government's going to be telling us how much grain to grow. And I think it's a bit of an extreme reaction. And so I want to.
But I said that.
Well,
that's putting words in my mouth.
You were talking about a centralized. What was the phrasing? The government
essentially. Yeah, my point was this, Brian. Not that we're on the precipice of the government becoming a totally centrally planned economy. My point is, if they're not good at it, on the large scale, why do we think that? Oh well, they can't do it, but maybe if they just do it a few times, then it's okay. No, they're bad at it.
Okay, so let's take a look at some other places that they have gotten involved. The one of them that I wanted to bring up was the interstate highway system, which was a entirely federally government funded system that made it possible for interstate commerce and for travel and business and everything else to occur. And it was 1956, Dwight Eisenhower put together the system. And there was two main reasons why he did that. One was that back in 1920, I think it was, he was part of a military convoy going from one base to another. And it took an obscene amount of time. The roads were in horrible condition. Machines were breaking down because it was so bad. And the other was that when he was fighting in Germany in World War II, he was so impressed with the Autobahn system. He wanted the same thing here in the US. And so they put some rules in place. They had the roads all had to be free, no toll roads, and they all had to be built to certain standards. And the federal government was going to pay for it. The states would build it, federal government would pay for it. It didn't get completed until 1992. That was 36 years that was being worked on. And I think most people would look at the interstate system as being really beneficial to overall our economy and our way of life and how often we use that. So I'd say that was an example of the government actually being successful.
I mean, yeah. And once again, I would say before I take apart that argument a little bit, I would reiterate that I don't think that they're always going to make bad decisions. I would agree. It's not that they're always going to make bad decisions. I can't make that argument. I don't think that would be believable. I just disagree with that argument. I believe that they do make good decisions from time to time.
Okay.
Look at that whole that investment in infrastructure. There's a lot of good to it. I mean, but look at every major infrastructure problem or investment that happens right now. Every single one of them that you ever hear about is it's not finished on time and it's way over budget. And if you ever drive down the road and look at those guys, sometimes I do look at those things and I wonder what the right solution is, because maybe it's just that government has to do that type of stuff. It is a difficult problem. I'll grant you that. That one's tough, because what are you going to do? Say everything's a toll road or something? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's a difficult one, and we could maybe look up some libertarians and see what they're thinking about it, just to get some other ideas. But maybe it's just the way we have to do it. Maybe this is the best way we have to do it. Is the way that Dwight Eisenhower did it, and those guys are doing it, because it's a tough one. But every single one, like, for example, when you get off I-15 by my house and you head out towards the canyon where I live, there is a massive, they call it a commuter lane. So there's 2 lanes going each direction. And then there's this huge like bridge that kind of it crosses over at one point. And so you can get from the highway down to my house almost with no traffic lights, because this huge commuter lane heads out there, which is really handy. I mean, and I go to the house and I benefit from it. I'll grant you that. But yeah, every time I look at it, I just wonder, like, man, was that really necessary? Like, sometimes you're going along and it just doesn't save you any time. The lights kind of, aren't that bad. And so people are kind of, they're ending up where they need to be, or you get to the end of the commuter lane when you're getting on the freeway. And because the way the traffic lights work, it's backed up. It takes you longer to get off the commuter lane than it would to go the whole way down the 2-lane road. And so it's not the most efficient way to do it. And then that intersection there at Thanksgiving Point is so busy. And nobody would have predicted it. Like 20 years ago when I first came out to Utah, it was like farmland out there. Now all these businesses are there. Adobe's out there. They call it Silicon Slopes or something like that, because all these businesses have found. Goldman Sachs has an office out there. There's WeWork has an office out there. There's massive like high-rise buildings that nobody could have predicted a long time ago. And they have redone that intersection like 4 times. I mean, a total do it, then it starts to grow, and all of a sudden they need more traffic to get through there. And so maybe they were the best, but when they make a mistake and it's not a good investment, just throw more money at it and redo it again. And then when they make a mistake, just throw more money at it and do it again. Like when companies do this, they run out of money. But the government doesn't. They just say, well, that was a bad choice, but we need more people to get through here, so we'll redo it again. Like they have those where you go to the left lane in order to turn right. Like it's all these different innovative ways to try to get traffic through there, but they've had to redo it 4 times in like 10 years.
Because of growth.
What's that?
Because of growth.
Because of growth.
Well, I don't know how you I don't know how you get around growth. I mean, growth is going to happen, and things change. We know families move into bigger houses, or they add additions. That you can't look at it and say, well, we should have known beforehand that we were going to have 5 kids, and instead of buying a 2-bedroom house, we should have moved into a 6-bedroom house. Well, we have to move. I mean, that's just what you do.
The point is, when companies make bad decisions, it shows up on their financial statements, on their balance sheet, and people can decide whether to keep investing with them and decide, well, how could they have known? And I'm going to keep investing with them, or it was a bad decision. With the government, what do? Raise taxes or just spend more of the money, and nobody knows where it goes.
Yeah.
Like that, and I'm not saying like that maybe we should necessarily not do it, but to act like these are good investment decisions, no, they're not. They're just they can just get more money and get more taxes from us. They don't have to. They're not accountable the same way that we are. And we don't even know who made the decisions, which politicians we would vote out of office. There's no accountability.
Well, and I think to address that particular issue, if you are clearly unhappy about the nuclear decision that people have made over the last 40 years, you can change that. Get a bunch of your friends together and go and start talking to your people in Congress. I mean, they work for you. And if you can start to convince them in a way that makes sense and show them the value of it, I think that you'd make some traction. This is your job as a voter and as a citizen, because this is something you can have an impact on. Now, I do want to get back to the Tesla argument, because there was something that I was sort of curious about. I wanted to know, would it be possible? I think you had made this argument before. He didn't need government help. He could have just gone and started smaller and maybe scaled up or something. And so I was curious about, we don't see a lot of new car manufacturers happening. And I think part of the reason why, if you go back to like the Henry Ford and the Model T story, that he had to, the assembly line is what made it all possible, but he already had this big factory already happening. In fact, I looked up and read the story. When he started producing the Model T and working on his efficiencies, he changed the assembly line, or the building of a car production time went from 12 and a half hours. And then by the time he had really refined it, it went to 93 minutes. No, I'm sorry, 93 hours to 12 and a half hours. So he was able to really make it so much more efficient. And that was why the Model T was so affordable. And that was why his workers were able to afford to buy it. And so this becomes really important when you're looking at something like automobiles, when you're looking at something that a large object that is very expensive, that efficiency and scale becomes very important. And so I wanted to find out, are there other car manufacturers that are small that we hadn't heard of? And when I was looking around for it, most of the small car manufacturers are doing like boutique, high-end, really fancy, hand-built, really special little vehicles. There was nobody out there trying to build cars for the average person, except, and you're going to love this. Let me show you this picture, the commuter car. This is being built in the state of Washington, or they're trying to build it anyway. They call it the Tango, the commuter car, and it's a really funny looking little car. It's electric, of course. They're claiming it's going to be super safe because all the weight is down on the bottom. When you look at the interior shots, it looks like the old Yugo. But what's really interesting about this particular car is the scale of economy on it, which is that they were trying to build up some interest so they could start building the vehicles, and that they had the formula worked out as to how much money they would need in order to build the cars. And if they had one person buying a car, if they're building one car, just the one car by itself, it was going to cost them $240,000. If they were building 10 cars, each car would cost $200,000. If they're building 100 cars, each car would cost $100,000. But once they got up to 25 cars a year, those little dinky cars were going to be costing $80,000 each. And they're pretty basic in terms of technology and functionality. I mean, yes, you have the battery technology, which is still hard to come by, but they're not complex cars. They don't have a lot of high-end equipment. They don't have a lot of, handcrafted products. So you're talking $80,000 for these things that you could basically build from a kit in your garage. And this is where the scale comes into place. And this is why it would have been so difficult for Tesla to, out of the gate, try and build something small, especially when there was no supporting technology, when there was no charging infrastructure in place. You'd have to have, people that were going basically to work and home, and that's all they could do because they would only have their charger at home. And so to have an electronic car technology or an industry, you have to at the same time build the charging industry. And if you look at you do it privately, you can't build one without the other. And so the two have to happen at the same time. And so in order to happen efficiently, it really did require government investment. Response.
Yeah, I disagree. I mean, obviously.
Of course.
I mean, you make the argument that that's the only way it could have happened. Like, it did have to grow somewhat organically, but if it were really a good decision, then the market would be willing to invest in it. Companies would be willing to work together on it. Like, who knows what other ideas they would have come up with? Maybe they would have come up with a more efficient way to tap into 110 outlets, or he could have started in Silicon Valley and expanded from there. And then once he proved his model there and it really worked well and people were loving it, he could have gone someplace else. I mean, investors, this is what they do. To say that, I mean, there's all kinds of industries out there that have sprouted up without the help of government, and a lot of them take large investments. And to say, I get the argument for economies of scale, and you need to get to volume first, and that's what Elon Musk was trying to do. But that's not the only way to be successful. A lot of times, you look at economies of scale, and they can be great. But you look at any large company and go look at the waste that they're generating. It's really hard to run a large company efficiently. And that's why many times somebody that's more focused comes in and starts stealing market share from them, where they often see competitors. One example of it is Aldi. You and I talked years ago about how nobody would be able to compete with Walmart because they were such a juggernaut. They had so much power. They forced everybody else out of business. And Aldi came in and started building. Yeah, have you ever heard of Aldi before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're a German company.
A German company. They came in and they started to build stores right on the other side of the parking lot from Walmart. And so you could get everything you wanted at Walmart, but come get some cheap produce and food at Aldi, because they found that they could be a little bit more efficient than Walmart in that particular area. People always come and start to take away market share from these big companies, and they do have economies of scale. I get it, but there's other ways to compete. And when you look at all that's been done for these car industries, a big part of the reason why they have been so successful and it's been so hard for other companies to step in and take market share away from them is because of the massive subsidies that have gone into these industries. I mean, they have bailed out the auto industry numerous times. And if they hadn't, then other companies would have been able to compete with them, probably because some of them or all of them would have gone bankrupt. The oil and gas industry is heavily subsidized, which is by extension subsidizing those car industries as well. So all these years we were convincing people not to come up with an alternative because we're subsidizing the oil and gas industry, which is subsidizing these internal combustion industry car companies. And then there's all kinds of regulations that Elon Musk found out about when you try to open up dealerships in all these different states. And they didn't want him to sell in different ways because there were all sorts of regulations in government about how you can run dealerships and who can open them and who can own them. So yeah, there's all kinds of adverse incentives that we have in place, stopping people from competing with these industries that already exist.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, there are. But also keep in mind that the Tesla, all the vehicles, their cheap model was like $45,000 or something like that. You know, these are competing with Lexus and Acura and higher end vehicles.
Honda Accord is that much.
Is it really?
Yeah, a Honda Accord's like $42,000.
Okay.
I mean, people pay that much for cars. I don't think, I mean, a 35, I think that, and it's hard to know, like if you got the base stripped down model of a Tesla, I think it's, the Model 3, it's like 35, maybe it's up to 40 now. I mean, inflation has kind of pushed it up. And then, could you really get one like that? Or if you just because they have you have to pay an extra $1,000 if it's any color but white. And then the interior, you pay an extra $1,000 if it's any color but black. And then if you want the performance model, then it's more. If you want different rims, it's more. But the base stripped down model, I think it was below 40. I think it still is. And that's a Honda Accord. I mean, it's pretty close to a Honda Civic. They're not the most expensive. They started out with a Model S, which was, 70. And I think if you get any kind of options on it now, it's like over 100. And then the Model X, and now they have the more economical Model 3 and the Model Y.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, my point, I don't know. What's that?
My point being that these were not really designed for the average car buyer, in part because it was a new technology. And also he put a lot of, fancy high end stuff into them. And like you say, as you start to get these add-ons, but, really bringing it up to typical functionality, it's going to cost you a little bit more money. And part of the reason is that
typical functionality.
What's that?
It's not to get the typical functionality. You get the base model and you're getting it's very good technology that's higher than typical functionality.
No, yeah, you may be right. I can't really argue the issue, but they especially when they first came out, if there were no chargers around other than the one you had at your home, it was going to have to be a second or a third car. You couldn't have just this car. And so it really was an investment in the not just the electric car industry. And of course, investing in electric car industry also affected all the other people, not just the big three that are building electric cars, but also the was it Rivian? Is that the people that are building the electric trucks now?
Yep.
All of them are going to be benefiting by this infrastructure that's going in place. Now, we're about to run out of time. We have 5 seconds left. Sorry, I'm sorry I had the last word on your call.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.